All right, today is February 7th, 2022. It's the distribution team demo. The topic is OpenShift deployments. And what I have done, I have pulled together a proof of concept implementation, largely based on everything that we already had in our repos, just wiring it into the pipeline and kind of streamlining things. So I'll just go with sharing my screen and where things are at. So like I said, it's a proof of concept, so it lives in my private repo. It's private repo. I invited the whole group in there, so people should have access into the repo itself. Not sure about the rest, but we'll talk about it later. So with that being said, the entire setup, like I'll just walk through the entire setup from start to finish, and then we can kind of pick apart what's out there. So the entire setup consists of two kind of sections.
Dimitri, I'm mostly just seeing your Slack at this point.
What? It didn't do the, oh, let me do the other thing. Stop the share. Let me do it again. Does that work better?
Yeah, it looks much better.
All right. Did I just stop it?
Yeah, but now it's gone.
I hate this toolbox that just sits in the front of you, but let me do this again. I'm sorry, my Zoom just decided to terminate itself. Can you guys at least hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Hear and see.
Because typically when it self-terminates, my audio just goes south, but not today, I guess. Okay, I'll leave that toolbar alone and let's just hope I can navigate things. So here's the documentation and basically kind of lines out what needs to be done. For the prerequisites, one has to create the, we're talking about creation in GCP. So one has to create the service account and enable certain APIs inside the project into which the OpenShift deployment is going to go to. So all of that is done through that simple single script and just different entry points into the script. So you just create the service account, then you assign the account roles, and then you just enable the APIs that you will need for this thing to proceed. As a result of this, you will get the JSON file with the authentication credentials. Let's go back to there. So when you define Google application credentials, and I think I should have mentioned it here. Oh yeah, I did. Yeah. So that's the file into which the credentials are going to be saved for the Google Cloud. The other thing that needs to be done is one has to fetch the pool secret, either from Red Hat directly, or we have it in our in 1Password. So that's the second piece, and the third piece is SSH key, public key. I'm going to use mine through the demo, but that's another one. So once this is done, that's when the pipeline actually can kick in. So what I have done so far, I created a repo with a pipeline in there, and that pipeline is practically is just a single pipeline that can serve multiple environments. So you can just do this, put in the cluster name. And here for this is where I'm kind of a little iffy. You have to submit things as files, but you cannot by default make them files, so you have to flip it. So xclip. Oh, let's go up. Go up. So we'll dump. That's the SA that I already created. And here's my xclip with my public key. And we can just run that pipeline and it will try to create the environment. And while it's going to be doing this, I've got another one already set up so we can actually take a look at the end result. So this is all that I kind of put as the entry points. So if anything needs to be customized, this version of the cluster actually controls which tools are we downloading, because apparently OpenShift setup depends on the tool that you downloaded. So it's a one-to-one. You can't download one OpenShift installer and try to install a different cluster, at least not from what I can see, unless Dustin knows more on this account, but it didn't look that way. So after all that filled, just run that pipeline. And while this thing is running, so this section, the configure cluster, is a dummy section. Like I did not do anything in there. I was just sorting out all the rest of the things. So there is only one command, ls, that's it. Nothing much, but it's something what we want to do after we install the cluster and what we wanted to kind of install into the cluster right after that. So if we now go to the existing environments, there's one already there, the 16 that I created earlier. And to see what was happening, you can just go to the job that created it. And here's the first unfortunate bit. It just spits out the credentials right there in the log. And there's nothing I've seen that actually disables that. So that's my first hurdle. It's like, I'm not, like, I can probably just redirect the whole thing, pipe it through and try to filter the output, maybe, sort of. I still need that data, so I can try to pump it into something else. But we'll get to that later. If you go to browse of the artifacts, because I'm submitting the entire thing into here, and I'm guessing that all of those credentials are going to be in that log. Again, artifacts are still private, so you shouldn't be able to. Let's open it with OK, right? Oh, wrong screen. Let's go back down to this. Yeah, it's right there. So in theory, just piping it into dev null or something probably would be okay to work around the issue of having all that plain text output. I look for more elegant solutions. I haven't found one.
We could always make it so this password we see here doesn't matter. Like in that configure step, change the password.
Yeah, that was my second. I actually, okay, since we're talking about this, let's just go, like, I created all the issues that I have encountered so far. It's just 6 of them. Where is the, there. Okay. Oh, and I didn't pump it here. Anyway, so yeah, it was exactly, Dustin, exactly what you were saying. I was just thinking about, and I actually dug up the documentation on that account that talks about changing the user password, the kubadmin. No, it talks about removing the kubadmin. It doesn't talk about the change in the password, but from the steps I've gathered is just you create the credentials, some credentials, and assign it the cluster admin role, and then you can remove the kubadmin. But even with that, for the short period of time, there's going to be a clear text representation of the credentials before we provision. So there's a small window. I don't know. So now we're going back to, now you guys have seen more or less in rough details what it does. So a couple of assumptions that I have made. It's a private repo, so nobody but our group has access to it. That's why I took the liberty at storing things into the artifacts. So you can download, if you go back to any of the successful pipelines, come on, into deploy cluster, you can actually get the whole thing, everything that you would normally get on your workstation, including the binary file that was used to install that. So going back is easy. In terms of environments, again, I tried to utilize the environment feature that GitLab already has. So we can have as many environments as we want, and stopping it is just you hit the stop and the environment's done. It'll just decommission the entire thing, and that's it. And I checked afterwards, there are no leftover resources after you hit the stop. So it does it cleanly. We can go and try to check some of the stop ones. Let's say the 15. Yeah, I was doing that today in the morning. So if we go into the stop cluster, that's all it does. So it just runs the destroy cluster and does whatever the OpenShift installer does on the destroy command. I did find a few things, but we'll get back to this in a second, that may not require us to store all the artifacts for the destroy phase, and there's another issue that I kind of came across, and that is ability to rerun the job, or if we want to update something about the cluster and we want to rerun the OpenShift installer against that cluster, it's not immediately obvious how to do that, not to mention that you cannot get the current state of the cluster immediately because it's gone with the job. Like the pipeline has completed, it's enclosed within the pipeline. So a couple of ideas I was tinkering with, in my mind at least, and that is we can make it into branch per environment kind of situation. So every time we open a new environment, we create a brand new branch and we run that pipeline against that branch. That way the artifact is going to be stored with that environment kind of hashed in, because you will have the CI ref name in the path, so you can download the artifact specifically from the pipeline for this particular branch. That'll be one way of doing it. The alternative that came to my mind was using the object storage, GCP, AWS, doesn't matter, and just throw our artifacts into the private bucket. And that's what I've done previously in my past experience in my previous jobs. That's exactly what we were doing. We would be chucking the artifacts into the external repo, and then those can survive anything, and you can attach them to specific locations, and then you can fetch them properly and everything. The things to consider, it's a lifecycle management. So you have to, when the environment gets deleted, you have to go and delete stuff from the bucket. Shouldn't be that complicated. Security management, that's another aspect. That's where if security settings on the project have changed, somebody has to go and control the security settings on the bucket. Or for example, we got a new team member, we need to allow them access to the project and to the bucket. So that's a bit of a complication, but it does open some other things. Something that Jason has mentioned previously, and I was kind of curious about that, support for the Terraform TF state files. OpenShift is not that open in that regard. The way they do the Terraform is they're using the Terraform libraries. So all the assembly of Terraform manifests is happening behind the scenes. We don't even see it. We don't get to interfere with it. And anything we want to add to the Terraform processing is not really available to us at the moment. Like, unless we try to go back to the upstream project and try to contribute something that will make it possible. And I've seen people actually asking that particular question. There was question about saving the OpenShift state into the S3 buckets. And that was Terraform involved there too. And the answer was no, so far. So the other one, what I did use in this pipeline is our GitLab operator image, build image, because it contained all the tools I needed: Helm, kubectl, JQ, something else was there. Let me take a look. wget, yeah. And it assumes it's an Alpine-based image, so because we add JQ right there. So there's a possibility for optimizing that and not fetching the big giant image that has the Golang in it and things like that, because we don't need them for this particular case. That's the external storage for the artifacts. And that was, yeah. That's where most of the information on this one went. So we can decouple stop from deploy, because right now, if we take a look at the pipeline, I had to do stop needs deploy cluster. Why? Because we need all those artifacts from the deploy stage to be fetched. And that's how you do it. And that will create something that Mitch will probably be the most intimately familiar with. If we fail the deployment, it's half-assed deployment. You can't run stop because the deployment has not completed. So both. That's a bummer right there. But that's the way it's wired right now. Again, proof of concept, open for discussion or whatever on this front. And the last one was it's mostly artificial and cosmetics. I was rendering the URI from the data that was given to me, and it was rendering into something much shorter. And then whatever the OpenShift installer generates, it's actually quite redundant. It's a console, OpenShift console .app .whatever. So I thought maybe there is a way of getting around that. And I kind of dug a little bit more, and I found that there is this OpenShift documentation suggests that we can add additional routes. So that's a subject for experimentation later down. For the time being, I just soft wired that console OpenShift console apps into the URI, just making it at least workable. So if we go now to deployments environments, and you want to take a look at this one, the 4917, you just click here and you get to, oh, that's the old deployment. That's why. I'm sorry. This one didn't complete yet. That one was before the fix. This guy will actually have all the proper links. Now, there. Yeah, go like this. Yeah, and actually the good news, I guess good news is it takes about 26 minutes, give or take, to stand up a cluster, start to finish. So it's not terrible. With that being said, that's pretty much all the intro I had, and now I'm really open to any input and what people think about how should, like, especially what I'm really, really curious about is how we're going to be managing like this ability to rerun the jobs, and whether we want to go the route of doing branch per environment, things like that, or do we even want to leverage the environments like I did in this proof of concept.
Dimitri, I'm curious about if you could just touch on the scope of the proof of concept in terms of like how much code did you have to write? So you showed us at the beginning those scripts. Is that all new as well, or how much of that is reused from existing stuff?
Pretty much all of it is recycled from the existing repo. I just yanked it from out of some of the GitLab operators. I think it's all from the GitLab operator. Dustin, you correct me if I'm wrong, because you were the guiding star pointing me at the right scripts, because I started off writing my own, and then Dustin mentioned that we already have some of that stuff done. So I just lifted those and moved it over. So it was not as much work. I just, for example, create OpenShift cluster. I merged some functionality into it, so we have fewer scripts to deal with. And some of the stuff I streamlined, just making it a little bit more palatable, but that was minor changes rather than, any rewrites. So there was not much of a code to begin with.
So then mostly the scope here was just getting the existing scripts into CI then?
Yeah, like I said, I started off with a vanilla OpenShift commands just to make sure that I know what I'm doing and what I'm getting. And then I went and it's like, okay, now I know what it's doing and now I know it's working. We can go and recycle the scripts that we already have and, get a little bit more functionality into it. And that's what I did. So yeah, it's more or less it's recycling the scripts.
Yeah, is that the same case with the service account and the roles added to the service account, or is that
Yeah.
new stuff? Okay.
Yeah, couple of things that we had. There's no ticket or any other mention of the DNS, but there was a fun time we had with the DNS setting up because going back to so I'm working in my private project that I created with that staging toolbox that we've been given some time ago. So I created a very separate project from our cloud native whatever. So this is fresh new. There was nothing there. So we had a chance to test all of those scripts to create the API, enable the APIs, create the service account and everything else, make sure that it actually works. So now we're at the stage where this repo contains only the stuff that you really need to start the OpenShift cluster, recycled from the original. Some were enhanced because the original actually had fewer APIs enumerated, but I just went and grabbed everything from the documentation, and there is the reference to the documentation where I was getting the information from. So all of that, I just dumped it in and just made sure that we have all of what they're asking for, at least for the moment. If we need to shrink it down for security reasons or what have you, we can do that too. For the time being, we like just adhering to the official documentation.
I have some thoughts on a couple issues you brought up here. First off, this is great. Like just the visibility alone of having the environments in CI and being able to see what they were launched with, like that's great. The whole team will benefit from that. As far as lifecycle management, I think after working with this stuff and working with the OpenShift install tool, I think it would be best if we just treated these clusters as stateless, like we're not managing their life cycle. And that's what the caveat of we should be able to install like cert manager and install updates to cert manager, like at the Helm level. I'm not considering that as part of the state, but the state that comes from like the actual cluster configuration, like we already know how to scale nodes up and down as needed. We don't really like if we're going to change to different instance types, for example, I would say just delete the cluster and start a new cluster, especially since we're under 30 minutes now for cluster creation. It used to be closer to an hour for 4.6, but we're in a better spot now. I just feel like that would avoid a whole lot of lifecycle management work for these clusters. So that's thought one. As far as artifacts, like there's really only 3 things in that artifacts folder we care about. The rest is just junk, I guess. If their Terraform is not easy to hook into, then all that Terraform stuff is junk.
It is.
That, yeah. And so that would be, the metadata.json file, which allows you to delete clusters. That's the only file you need, and your credentials, of course. And then the other 2 files are your kube config and your kube admin password for the root user. And so, another step in that another thing to do in that configure step, since 1Password has a CLI, would be to just upload those directly to our 1Password vault as part of the pipeline. And then maybe the decommission step could delete them from 1Password when we delete clusters. Just less manual steps,
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, do we need, or are we required to have all those credentials in 1Password, or are we okay with, because those environments in theory are transient because they're alive for some period of time and then they're going to go away. So managing everything in one place seems appealing. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it other ways. I'm just saying, are there reasons for us to push it into the 1Password or just keep it all together?
Well, I think we're already putting the kube configs and the passwords in 1Password. So it seemed to me that the leap of uploading the metadata file would just be another addition to the process we already have. I don't think we should get into this topic on this call, but having people being able to SSH into our OpenShift clusters that produce CI artifacts is not such a great idea anyway, if we're worried about like build reproducibility and minimizing our threat vectors. So that's another thing to think about here.
Okay.
Are we using those things? I'm sorry, I'm late, to tear down as well? You mentioned we're already putting stuff up there.
The nitty-gritty detail of this is that they actually do not use much of the data in that directory out of that, what Dustin mentioned, the metadata JSON, and that could be actually manually recreated. So I put somewhere in there, I actually put information on how to generate this. Yeah, this one. So we can use script similar to this. This one is for AWS, but basically it just describes the VPCs to figure out the labeling. And then it just creates the metadata from scratch, just specifying what the cluster ID is and whatever. And then you just do OpenShift install, destroy, and it will just destroy the cluster. So the rest of the stuff in the artifacts, it really is not necessary specifically for the destroy. It seems that's what I'm reading from this ticket that I found.
Yeah, I've tested it. You only need to be authenticated to GCP and have that metadata JSON to delete a cluster.
Yeah, and what their comment there says that the TF state has nothing to do with the cluster teardown because it doesn't know about this resources the cluster. So I'm not even sure what has happened to the Terraform under the hood, because this is not a normal behavior. You would expect something different, but from the response I'm seeing here, yeah, metadata.json is all we care for, really.
Well, I just thought of something though. The install config, I don't know, maybe that's not important because we're putting the parameters in, but if we needed that install config.yaml for debugging reasons or whatever, when OpenShift install runs, it consumes that file, it deletes that file for some reason out of the install directory. I'm just thinking that might be useful to have later on too.
And the answer is yes, because I actually do generate that and save it into a file.
Awesome.
Here's the create config right there. So if you take a look at this, install, there it is. So you can go back to it and do whatever you want with it. So this pipeline does that right now because I try to disassemble the setup into multiple steps that each one is more or less atomic. So we can deal with each one separately rather than the whole bunch of things at once. So yeah, I can work on. Yep.
Anything secret in that file, that config file there?
There is your GCP credentials, And I do believe let me take a look at the template itself. It'll be easier to tell. No, project ID, pull secret is in there, and the public key is in there. Public key is not that big of a deal. Pull secret is something that we probably don't want to expose. Everything else is pretty much public.
Because I was just thinking, like for the most part, when we spin up clusters, this is the file that configures, represents what it'll look like, right? So if we did your idea of having a branch per environment, this could be the file that changes per branch, and then we can compare branches and see what's different and how environments were configured. Would be a perk of that approach.
Precisely, yeah. That was kind of one of the things that comes out of branch per environment approach, when you can deviate your environments depending on where they are if you need to. So say 4.9 right now looks like this, but 4.10 requires an additional setting in there, so we can actually go and add that setting, and we don't have to. Yeah.
Does the version go in this file too? Where does the version get set?
Version is baked into the installer itself. Like I said,
Okay.
that's the tight coupling that they're doing. So when you launch the pipeline, it just fetches the proper installer and just runs with it. Right.
Got it. So you're setting like a CI variable that pulls.
Yeah, I can go back and kind of briefly show the launch screen for the pipeline where it's
I'm kind of thinking in the context of we have to make 4.9, right? So what would that process look like?
Yeah. Come on. There you go. Cluster version right there. So that's what specifies which tool it's going to download. And again, that was lifted off the old script that was in there. We just specify this, and it goes into the Red Hat site /OCP or OC, whatever, and fetches the binaries.
And I think it's just a matter of permissions, but I've seen pipelines that were launched with these variables, and they're hidden, like it's all stars. So is that just a matter of permissions? Like if you go to one of the pipelines, can you see all the configuration that was passed in for that pipeline? There's usually like a little table on the right-hand side.
Let's take a look. I think some of the stuff is more, actually, I configured only one thing at the site level. Let me do a real quick look at variables CI/CD. So yeah, pull secret is in there and it's marked as protected. That's for sure. Everything else, it should be not that protected, but let's take a look. The only way it will pop up, it may pop up here, but it does not. Yeah, this one is just fetching the content. Debug, that one just spits practically everything out.
Yeah, like in that right-hand column you're looking at, I've seen pipelines where there's a table there showing the key and the value for the variables that you passed in when you started the pipeline. I'm mostly thinking about observability. So we launch an environment, what configuration was passed in, and if it's not super visible here, maybe we should go the route of branching, and then that config file is part of the branch.
Yeah, so that table you're talking about, Mitch, for some reason, and there's issues to fix this, it only shows up for triggered pipelines and triggered only. So it doesn't show up for ones you run like normally off a Git commit, or the ones you manually trigger from the UI for whatever reason. It only shows up for triggered
that makes
pipelines
sense
at the moment. There's issues to expand it to make more sense.
Cool.
To make it standard, but
yeah, that answers that. I guess still it'd probably be more observable if it was just in a file in the branch, but I guess either way should work, because if you go to the environments list, the environment pipeline is attached to it. So you just click that pipeline and see how it was
precisely.
So
That's what I was kind of thinking, because the environment here is kind of encapsulating everything that you would want to know about this environment, which pipeline fired it off. All the details are right there in the name. I specifically kind of attached that, cluster version at the end, so you know what you're dealing with. Yeah. And then going to the environment is not a big deal either. It's right there. It's the link. So
yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I think having like a file per branch is still nice though, but it could just be like that you're just updating defaults in the GitLab CI file.
Yeah, again, it's per branch, so you could do that for sure.
I'm thinking about dev clusters. like we have .com and dev clusters that share the same version. How would that work if we were going the branch route? Like, because when we want that configuration to be in the dev repo and the dev CI pipeline launches it instead of the .com? Because right now we basically launch everything via .com and then use it in dev, but it might be useful to have separation.
We could probably just isolate that. In terms of where the OpenShift cluster is going to be instantiated, like for example, this is something that I kind of glanced over, but the GCP project ID is actually being extracted from the SA credentials. The SA credentials JSON contains the project ID, so I'm extracting it there. So if you generate it for a completely different project, it will instantiate it there. It doesn't have to. That's why I didn't put it at the top level. I figured we'll leave it as an input for the end user. But again, if we decide that we only going to create it within one project and then on occasion we're going to override, there's still a possibility of overriding it. It's like whatever is comfortable for the team, really.
Yeah, I guess
Okay.
we would mirror this project to dev and then go to the project in dev and launch a cluster there for dev is probably what we would do. First thought.
Yeah, run a dev pipeline to launch a dev cluster.
But here's the question, like, do we need to?
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about as well. I wonder if we just need one project for this that can launch for both, like launch both dev and
You
GitLab.
guys are saying the caller isn't specific, right? It doesn't matter.
Technically, that would mean we could put this in the ops instance, the third instance.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the point was to avoid dependency on .com, right? If .com is the one launching our dev clusters, then we're dependent on it, right? But you're right. If we put it in ops, maybe that's where it makes the most sense.
Yeah, right now it's very, very generic, so it doesn't really care where the target cluster is going to be instantiated. And that, by extension, it doesn't really care where it runs from. Because what else is changing other than pool secret? And pool secret is going to be the same across anyway. So
Yes, maybe ops then.
last question then, and since Mitch brought up the subject, do we want to move it out of POC and into some more permanent space, or would it be more prudent for me to kind of hammer it off a little bit further in my private space? And I can knock out that ticket with creation of the OpenShift 4.9 with this, because it doesn't really matter if I do it on my workstation or I do it through this pipeline. But address any further ideas or issues further down the line and not worry about it at this point in time. And I'm kind of open to any suggestions here.
Yeah, my 2 cents is I would say as soon as you figure out how to get the password to not spit out in the logs, you could just move it somewhere it's all visible and then we could collaborate on it. I don't really know the process for creating a project in ops or who has permissions there, but that's what I would see as the next step.
Yeah, for sure. Unless DJ or Steven have any objections.
I was going to maybe say something similar, but you just did a demo on it. Maybe give a day or two for folks to churn on it, resolve the password thing. Kind of similar idea. Get just a touch more polish on it so that folks, when we get some more people looking at it, it kind of makes sense and is easy for people to jump in.
Yeah,
That'd be my only. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I interrupted. But if you could add a team task issue, just so we could discuss like the ops versus dev versus all of their stuff and get that.
Oh,
done.
sure. Yeah.
But once we have an idea, like you can keep working on the rest of the stuff here in this repo, but once we have an idea, I can start looking at getting the right places opened for it to move it over. But that might take a while. So even once we decide we're going to do that, like don't wait on it.
Yeah, right at this moment, everybody should have maintainers permissions to that repo. So if anybody wants to jump in, feel free to.
And this is awesome for OpenShift. I know technically we would still want similar functionality for Kubernetes clusters, right? I know it's just basically clicking around in the UI, so that it would be much simpler, but technically we should have something more visible and traceable.
I was just thinking about that today as I was wrapping this.
It's probably just like a really simple G-Cloud command, but at least then it's traceable and it's got environments attached to it and stuff.
Yeah, and plus what I really like about going this approach is we codify our setup. So it's a guarantee that the next cluster is going to look like previous one exactly. Versus when it's running off a machine, we may miss, the error message and we think that something is installed and it's not. It's less than possible here.
Yeah, so this project might be called something like CI clusters, and then we've got logic for OpenShift and upstream K8s.
Yeah, something like that.
Cool.
Some
Picture in another environment called cluster type or something like that.
yeah.
That's coming up, right? Because we'll have FIPS clusters for testing at some point here. So that's different type.
That one was something, again, thanks to Dustin today, who pointed me to some of the documentation that is not so obvious with the OpenShift installed, but there's a switch for the FIPS compliance in OpenShift cluster deployment. So we could expose that as well as part of this entire pipeline and just say, okay, I want this cluster to be FIPS compliant, for example. I don't know, like unless we just want to have everything FIPS compliant and always deploy into FIPS compliant, I don't know. Maybe that's a better idea.
I think to be determined on that one. Thankfully, I looked into what operating system these cluster nodes are running, and it's already Red Hat Core OS, like RHCOS. So that's able to be FIPS enabled. They're not like Ubuntu or anything. Just checking that.
Okay. On that note, any more comments?
Thanks, Dmitro. This is going to be a big help.
All right. Awesome.
Yeah,
I'll
thanks.
stop the recording right there.
Sounds good. I'll get it